Season's greetings from Jeffrey Donaldson here with another Jeweler's Eye reading of a single poem from a new volume of Canadian poetry. We'll celebrate the holidays with a good sit-down with a fine poem from George Murray's 2012 collection of poems entitled Whiteout, ECW Press. Many gems to choose from in that volume, but I find my attention drawn back continually to this little puzzle piece entitled Rose. Surgery and injury kin, prune and plum, thorny trimmings piling up in the pot's saucer, limbs stacked level to the grave's lip. Cut and cut again, tree to bush to thumb, greened against those leaves, unaware death's not sensitive enough to know touch from grip. Intake, sudden breath. Beauty through pain's dumb memory. The loss you know is a plot compared to the wince you make with each snip. I seem to have been drawn towards a good many thing poems in the readings that I've offered so far. Thing poems that aren't just about the thing they put before themselves. Thing poems that are disguised epistemologies of how we know things and how we behave in the world towards them, and thereby thing poems that become a way of relating to and living among the ostensible riches of the world. It was only a year before Whiteout appeared in 2012 that George Murray published a wonderful book of aphorisms, selected aphorisms entitled Glimpse, also ECW Press, that's 2010, I believe. And we see the initiative there throughout of the diminutive verbal formula that contains within itself a compacted and energized wisdom. Murray has inherited from such modernists as Wallace Stevens, for instance, the search for the verbal formulas that become a kind of imaginative key that will unlock and admit us into the world around us. And I think there's something of this search for the most condensed, efficient, rarefied articulation of the essence of a thing in this small little three-tercet think piece. Again, the ostensibly simple title that with a little prodding yields more than its appearance might suggest. Rose is an object, but it is also the simple past tense of the verb to rise, and we don't have to look very far to notice that this poem is all about vertical orientations, where trimmings that fall down pile up in a space that where they then become stacked. Things that are cut and cut again accumulate in another space. This is a poem about trimming and pruning roses, and how we control the rose that rises, or the rose that rose, if you like. There are risings up and there are prunings down, and these play off one another in the poem in a way that will connect with a number of the other motifs we'll see as we go along. But let's just put it here on the table. The vertical context makes available it just in itself the resurrection motif. A thing that dies rises up. And that's certainly one of the implications of the first tercet, where the thorny trimmings in their fall pile up, that is, rise in an upward direction, stacked to a limit. We'll do more with that. So the poem ostensibly embodies a relationship to this form of beauty in the world. It is a meditation upon a rose, a handling of the rose, if you like, and even a verbal trimming of it that is an accommodation of an actual physical object to words themselves. And in that sense, we would be imagining the words themselves as a pruning and trimming of the actual object, a pruning and trimming of it, because it is accommodating that object to its own conditions. The growing, exuberant rose is trimmed back as it comes to be contained in the verbal formulas that point to it. So the rose fills out the poem, if you like. The poem makes room for the rose that it is talking about trimming and pruning. It is but one tiny step, then, to think of the poem itself as a kind of rose, a created and creative object whose energies, whose inclination towards an unruly rising need to be curtailed, pruned, trimmed under the poet's hand. We're thinking of the rose itself as being made up of little bits and pieces of extra growth, extravagance, or excess that need to be trimmed off. And we can see how Murray is creating a poem that is made up of just such bits and pieces. The poem is made up of little phrase packages, little branches, if you like. Surgery and injury, kin. I think that's so much a thing in itself. Prune and plum, again. Thorny trimmings, piling up in the pot's saucer, limbs stacked level to the grave's lip. Bits and pieces of juxtaposed phrases, cryptic little snippets. But notice too how each of these tercets in its own way possesses or evinces a fairly serious trimming or pruning. What has been pruned away in each instance is a conjugated main verb. Unless we're going to read prune and plum in the imperative, that is, that these are instructions, the first sentence licenses itself as a sentence fragment. No main conjugated verb there. If you're trimming a rose back, you need to cut away all the excess. Trim back, if you like, the active verbs that would represent our principal understanding of how a thing is behaving. The poem presents itself as a pruning of its own potential verbal excesses, trimming itself back to the essential original that it seeks to be about. So then, just to summarize there, this is a poem about a rose, this is a poem about an object, but where the poem as such looks to gain a certain authority as an object in its own right. The poem about a thing and the poem as a thing. The poem about a rose, the poem as a rose. And then see how that triangulates. The poem about a rose is a trimming of the rose, that is, there is an act of pruning and trimming the object, curtailing it into the conditions of language, but then the poem itself is subject to those same prunings and plumbings, those same trimmings. All of these in the service of enabling the created and creative energy to achieve its potential. And this is the theme throughout both the level of the rose and the poem itself, that for there to be healing and health, there must be hurt and constraint. It asks the question, is the health achieved worth the hurt caused? Is the healing worth the injury? So a poem with the broadest ethical implications. What are the ethics of our behavior in the world, our comportment towards things, our handling of the resources of the world, and then, of course, the ethical implication of poems that are about all of these things. Poems change things by writing about them, by accommodating them to their own verbal formulas. And what are the ethics of that? The rose is transformed. The rose is pruned and trimmed back in its accommodation to the language of the poem. And how are we to think of the losses and gains there? So, into the particulars, we could expect a poem that is about little snippets, little trimmings and prunings, to be working with its verbal formulas in a very intricate, scissored manner, if you like. And Murray's poem here is certainly one that rewards a careful attention to the excellent word and sound play, line by line, beginning surgery and injury, kin, prune and plum. Well, surgery and injury are kin, in that the second and third syllables of each of these two words, while literally different, are phonetically indistinguishable. Jury, surgery, and injury, they are kin. Kin itself anticipated in the in of injury. So straight off, the poem offers us this phonetic puzzle that embodies the thematic stakes of the poem. The surgery that heals is kin to the injury caused there. We leave off the lingual effects in surgery and injury and open up new sets of tensions, kin and prune and thorny, working together, but also plum, trimmings, limbs, this coming out very strongly, UMB, IMM, IMB, and the nasal consonant weighing against the percussive consonants in prune, plum, piling, pots, and lip. Prune and plum, these can be read as adjectives as well, both very rose-like colors, prune color and a plum color. So isn't that great? The aesthetic qualities of the rose, their prune and plum colors, themselves pruned and plumbed in the words that would evoke them. Thorny trimmings, excellent pun there. The trimmings from a rose would be quite actually thorny. But then there is the question of trimming itself being thorny. That is, it is a thorny question. These are thorny problems. It's a thorny business, trimming and pruning. So it's being quite actually descriptive, but also conscious of an ethics implied there. And this gets picked up, of course, in the rest of the sentence. Piling up in the pot's saucer, limbs stacked level to the grave's lip. A couple of things that we want to focus on here. First, that the losses accumulate, that the waste and excess is becoming an issue in itself. Of course, the last line in the tercet carries the gravest ethical implications in its recalling of archetypal Holocaust images of limbs stacked level to a grave's lip. So this making actual of the direst and most abject consequences of what someone else in another frame of mind might have called a trimming and a pruning, that one despot's cleansing is another victim's holocaust. Pot, despot, maybe something going on there, but perhaps even more so the phonetic pun of pot and poet. Pot in the pot's saucer, poet's saucer. These are for poets, of course, the gravest issues, the implication of the poet's own handling of words in much broader and much humanely urgent questions of behavior in the social world. And it recalls to my mind a wonderful paragraph from W.H. Auden's essay, The Poet and the City, contained in his volume The Dyer's Hand. And he writes, "A society which was really like a good poem, embodying the aesthetic virtues of beauty, order, economy, and subordination of detail to the whole, would be a nightmare of horror, for given the historical reality of actual men, such a society could only come into being through selective breeding, extermination of the physically and mentally unfit, absolute obedience to its director, and a large slave class kept out of sight in cellars." As he says just above, all political theories which, like Plato's, are based on analogies drawn from artistic fabrication are bound, if put into practice, to turn into tyrannies. It's this idea that if leaders behaved towards their citizenry as poets towards the words that populate their domains, we would have a mess indeed. And a tragic mess, of course, is what you get when fascist regimes count themselves as artists and their citizenry as so many aesthetic elements to be cajoled into their proper place. So these are the stakes then, right, that the poem announces. Again, how is the poem to think of its own relationship to the world that it itself handles, that it changes, that it prunes and manipulates, and how is it to think of itself as an object that is similarly pruned and trimmed, and the creative agency that does so? Where do we draw the lines, if you like, between creative, poetic acts and behaviors in the world? And what lessons can we draw from where those lines are drawn? And so the relations between hurt and healing become further complicated in this way. The first stanza gives us the trimming action itself, the pruning down of the bits and pieces that then accumulate. The second stanza turns its focus to something like the return of the repressed, where the trimming back causes damage to the trimmer himself. That is, cut and cut again, tree to bush to thumb. The cutting moves closer and closer to the thumb itself, that is, to the cutting agent. The sentence itself embodies this act of cutting back to the cutting agent, that is the thumb that is doing the cutting. Wonderful puzzle there. And the thumb is greened against those leaves, unaware death's not sensitive enough to know touch from grip. The thumb is greened against the leaves that it is cutting. So we're talking about the greening of the thumb against the cutting that it imparts. That is, what it cuts, it is greened by, but it is also, of course, the green thumb, the thumb that is good at making things grow. And some quiet work being done in the nuances of the preposition against there, meaning both rubbing along the surface of, the thumb is greened against the leaves, but then there is also the sense of negation there too, that is, the green thumb is negating the leaves in trimming them. Always this doubleness throughout. Interesting problem here, the question of the exact antecedent of our adjective unaware that initiates this final adjectival phrase in the sentence, unaware death's not sensitive enough to know touch from grip. What is it that is is unaware. The two likeliest possibilities are leaves and the thumb itself. Tree to bush to thumb, greened against those leaves, unaware, death's not sensitive enough. So there is both the object and the handler of the object, and there is the wonderfully ambiguous question of which of those is unaware, that death makes no distinction between touch and grip, between a gentle gesture of approach and a constraining and a destroying. The adjective unaware is a central word in the poem. It's quite actually a central word in the poem. It's in the middle line of the poem. This sense of an unconsciousness of harm and good in the context of the beauty it approaches, and thinking of unawareness, these sentence fragments themselves might be seen as a peculiarly poetic form of unawareness, where there is no conjugated verbal agency. So the upshot here, in the largest sense, this is a poem about a growing, beautiful thing, but then weighing against it is a kind of countering agency. If you can hear in the adverb not, the noun not, N-A-U-G-H-T, then you have death's not, death's negation of all the creative and healing and fostering initiatives in the poem. Poems that heal, poems that foster, poems that accommodate. No, the rose simply dies in this domain that is not itself. To contain the rose at all in these terms is to kill it. And so the plot thickens. Oh, and maybe speaking of thickening plots at this point, we want to note the wonderful wicker work of these three stanzas and how they are woven together. The rhyming pattern here is beautifully managed. We have ABC, ABC, ABC. How beautifully snipped and guided and interwoven are these lines. So then we come to the third stanza, the poem weighing these ambivalent, ambiguous consequences of our actions and behavior in the world comes to focus in this recognition of a self-inflicted hurt, as it were, this surprising recognition of a damage that has come home, a damage that is now reflexive, not a cutting and pruning of something outside ourselves, but a hurt that is exactly ours. So the cut and cut again, tree to bush to thumb, as we saw earlier, the cutting back to the thing that cuts, causing then the pain of the third tercet. And this, of course, is what the poem, in its beguiling self-consciousness, is demonstrating here. Its cutting back on its subject matter, as it were, is eventually revealed as a cutting back on itself. You trim away at your subject and eventually find that you have revealed your own poem's actual bone. Intake, sudden breath. Why am I thinking of Elizabeth Bishop's the intake and sudden breath of the yes in her poem The Moose? Murray would certainly know about that. But the sudden caught breath as you cut yourself, interwoven with the beauty, quite actually the EAT of breath with the EAUT of beauty juxtaposed there. The moment of the sudden breath itself is the moment of the achieved beauty through pain's dumb memory. Something here surely of Yeats's A Terrible Beauty is born from Yeats's poem Easter 1916, where Yeats himself in the same spirit takes up this agonized question of the relationship between violence and beauty. There is pain and there is beauty, and how are we to think of them together? I'm not sure that I'm going to be on track here, but there's this sense of the poem reaching towards a kind of awareness, an awareness of this complicated relationship, an awareness of itself in evoking it. So far as awareness is concerned, that is, being cognizant of something, there are these forms of knowledge in the final tercet. The loss, you know, is a plot, but also pain's dumb memory. These levels of awareness, that is, pain is dumb. It is a form of unthinking or unaware experience. So, if you like, there is a kind of stupid pain bound up with this form of beauty. The loss that you know is a plot compared to the wince you make with each snip. I kept wanting to hear the hurt you know is a plot. That would be pain's dumb memory. But that this form of knowledge is a loss seems to be what Murray is emphasizing here. But plot, picking up rhymingly the pot of the earlier trimmings piling up. And of course, therein the plot that is a grave, that is, the tragedies of loss that were invoked in the first tercet, but also the sense of plot as a story or a narrative, a conspiracy even, this sense of a mere plot compared to something else, compared to what follows now. And what am I saying then? There seem to be these two forms of becoming aware in the final tercet. The one, the sudden intake of breath, beauty through pain's dumb memory, that is a sense of a physical unconscious experience. And then there is the concluding wince that you make with each snip. The poem seems to be evolving towards that wince, that gesture at the end. There is, as we saw, very little conscious awareness in the first stanza, death's lack of sensitivity in the second stanza, but in the third, this sense of a wincing that embodies or represents the poem's own coming to an understanding. Wince is a wonderfully nuanced word. You can wince when you cut yourself, but a wince is often just as much an anticipation of a pain and also the facial expression, if you like, of a misgiving, a discomfort. So the poem, to its credit, doesn't try to resolve these issues in any overly simplified way with some such platitude that if you want to make an omelet you have to break a few eggs or so on, but instead offers a progression towards an increasing awareness that there are these ethical implications that attend our acts in the world. There is pain's dumb memory on the one hand, but then there is the conscience that has almost preceded it, the wince in each snip. And Murray's wonderful weaving together of those two words, the wince and the snip, inverting the IN and NI, maybe picking up the INs in the first line, but in any case, focusing in its own lettering the relationship between the act of snipping itself and the reaction of the consciousness that does so. So I do find the poem very challenging in this respect. It does seem strongly invested in the manifestation of the wince itself, in the recognition of the wince itself as such. The poem has throughout been corralling these tensions that abide in our creative acts, and has progressed from an original or an early state of unawareness towards the wincing that it concludes with. And is there in that perhaps a sense of a saving grace in the effort of the poem itself to make real its own ethical conditions and articulate those conditions, to actualize in its own verbal formulas the stakes that abide in its own behavior towards the beauties and forms that it addresses? And perhaps it appropriately leaves us then just at that point of a becoming conscious, but perhaps with this reminder, as the poem ends with a snip of its own. The final snip, if you like, is where the poem ends. The poem snips itself, as it were. That if we're thinking about the poem's handling of the world, we're also thinking about the poem itself as so handled, and that the ethical questions that abide in our handling of things in the world come to bear in our attitude towards and handling of the materials of language itself in the poem that is before us. The poem snips the rose, but the poem, as beautiful form in itself, is similarly snipped in the end, so that the ethical questions that flower in this little three-tercet puzzle piece might bring to fullest consciousness roses, poems, and our handling of them. I hope that makes a kind of sense. This poem certainly beguiles with these kinds of potential inferences, and I find myself excited and challenged to keep up with them. So our thanks then to George Murray for writing his poem Rose and including it in his latest volume entitled Whiteout, published by ECW Press in 2012.